So let me welcome the small but selected group that we have here. My name is Predrag Cicovacki. I'm Larry Cahun's colleague of many years at the College of Holy Cross, my 30th year of teaching at Holy Cross. And it's really my pleasure and honor to chair the session and introduce for now our first speaker, Philip Stambovsky of Fairfield University, probably well known to most of you, all of you, member of this society of many years and author of several important books. So Philip is going to give a paper on the nature of spirit as intelligence, the Onto-Epistemology of Inference and the factor of the Transcendent. So I think without further ado, we should let Philip read his paper, whether that's a shorter version or the version that he originally sent.
Yeah.
Please welcome. Well, I don't know how we do it on Zoom, but let us welcome the speaker.
No, it's okay. It's okay. Yeah, I hadn't been anticipating giving a presentation, for the meeting, but so I started the paper in January when I was pinch hitting. At any rate, the ideas in it are part of a long-term, what's turned into a long-term developing project in Onto-Epistemology, or the metaphysical approach to knowing as of being. It began with a critique of inferential thinking in 2009, and then what I consider a kind of special metaphysical work focusing on religious thinking, published 2019. And I've got a general metaphysic I'm trying to work on, dealing with truth, beauty, and the good, a modal analysis, like on Hartmann's mode, with respect to physical science, measurement, and religious thinking and art. But that's, if I live long enough, that's where that will go. So let me start in with this. Okay, consistent, at least in spirit, with this session's titular theme, spirit and nature, I wish to focus on the nature of spirit, specifically on the nature of spirit as intelligence, or in the unhandsome phrase, intelligential Geist. The aim is to consider from an onto-epistemological standpoint, from a systematic metaphysical standpoint, how spirit as operative intelligence, agent intelligence, is intrinsically inferential in character. To appreciate the reality of inference on this plane as a fundamental noetic moment of philosophical psychology is to understand how modern analytic moves to prescind knowing from being invite a suspension or lapse of intelligence relative to the known. On account of such express or tacit abstraction or bracketing of knowing from being, the onto-epistemology of inference, and with it the very nature of spirit as living intelligence, elude the explanatory categories and methods of analytic epistemology. This becomes quite clear in the aporias that attach to what too many analytic epistemologists have adduced as the principle of sufficient reason, of what amounts to the reason of inferential knowing. The problems emerge when we single out what they have posited as ultimately warranting how we know a fact, how we know what is, when that fact, that mode of being, is an evidenced as a conclusion that follows inductively, say, from a set of formally coordinate premises. The most prominent analytic philosophers of inference, among whom I number Rudolf Carnap, Gilbert Harman, and Robert Brandom, identified this principle that founds the noetic authority of inference, and by extension intelligence, as the vehicle of reckoning meaning as truth, in remarkably heterogeneous terms. Carnap, for example, invoked intuition. Harman adduced what he called best explanation rooted in an entire worldview, while Brandom appealed to propositional judgment generated by a so-called assertional practice hypothesized as a pragmatics of sociolinguistically determined semantic norms. That said, the point of this paper is not to outline an onto-epistemological critique of inference as such. The purpose, rather, is to consider how the reality that is spirit as intelligence finds in inferential thinking the reason of an intelligential Geist grounded in, or better, keyed to, the principle of knowing as of being, read in both the objective and subjective senses of the genitive. The truths of this first principle of inference, as understood onto-epistemologically, are not axiomatic, nor simply deductive. They emerge in self-verifying terms as transformative enlargements of intelligence through categorical analyses that dialectically educe alternative modes of knowing what is. With this in mind, I wish briefly to profile the nature of living agent intelligence in two categorically diverse yet paradigmatic modes of knowing meaning as truth, historical thinking, and religious thinking. The paper of which this talk is an abstract also covers mathematical logic from Gödel and existential intelligence, Nikolai Hartmann's approach. Okay, but prior to turning to historical thinking and religious thinking, however, it's essential to identify a touchstone for discriminating and appreciating how these modes of knowing witness to the onto-epistemological truths of the inferential agency that distinguishes the nature of intelligential Geist. One way to derive such a criterion is to think of the term nature in this paper's title as referring not only to the essence or character of spirit, but also to a defining naturalistic aspect of it. A naturalistic aspect of spirit that is most germane to this paper's larger aims is the nature of spirit as life, specifically life as in Georg Zimmel's phrase, more than life. Zimmel understands life as spirit in the form of noetic mentality. Ernst Cassirer puts his finger on the epistemological principle at the heart of Zimmel's Lebensanschauung when he observes that spiritual life at the intelligential level is, quote, never at one with itself except by being beyond itself at the same time, unquote. Zimmel argues that from within our formally constituted or cultural life world, we encounter the reality of what I term the factor of the transcendent as, in principle, something, says Zimmel, quote, inexpressible, indefinable, something that we feel of every life as such, that it is more than every assignable content, unquote. At the end of a chapter called The Turn Toward Ideas, the second in the study of Lebensanschauung, we see how Zimmel explicitly ties this to the factor of the transcendent as it obtains relative to the nature of life and its character as spirit or Geist. Here, he there summarizes his Anschauung this way. Just as life is a continuous begetting on its physiological level, so that, to use a compromised expression, life is always more life, so too on the level of spirit, it begets something that is more than life, the objective, the construct, that which is significant and valid in itself. This ascent of life beyond itself is not something added to it, but is its genuine, immediate essence, unquote. Zimmel then makes clear the relative nature of the factor of the transcendent that establishes objectively determinate meaning in life. This he does when he argues that our quote, creative life in the pursuit of productive life, which, quote, continually transcends itself, unquote, does so by, quote, setting up its other before it and thereby establishes this objectivity as its creation, unquote. Consequently, the nature of what I've been calling intelligential Geist is noetic life as it, quote, draws, in the words of Zimmel, quote, objective meanings, consequences, and norms into itself and forms itself according to what has been formed by it, unquote. The self-transcending act is what Zimmel sees as the turning point at which the meaning of human being acquires its existential objective coherence and significance as spiritual life. The various cultural forms that in Zimmel's language, spirit begets in the sciences, the arts, and religion instantiate the factor of the transcendent that is relative to each form as an objective supervenient ground of meaning in Zimmel's vision of our spiritual life. I turn next to the historical and the religious modes of thinking as they exemplify how the factor of the transcendent as the formal warrant of meaning configures spirit as noetic Geist. An order of spirit as intelligence that is scientific in the broad sense. Historical thinking is informed by the factor of the transcendent in its relative character. What it is relative to are the alternative historical approaches to artifacts and all the other data that the intelligible coherence, completeness, and meaning of which historians determine and explain in light of regulative ideas, categories of knowing as of being, that configure the inflection of spirit as historical intelligence. Each historical approach is itself operative as the factor of the transcendent vis-a-vis a set of artifacts, records, and other data, including earlier and competing historical accounts. And it so far sponsors as the principle of perspective, the inferential form of spirit as historical intelligence. Carl Lewith affords in this connection a way of seeing how the historian's thinking is informed by the factor of the transcendent, which is functionally the sovereign referent of meaning as historical truth that comes to life in the disclosive exposition of historical evidence or of evidence as historical. Lewis underscores precisely this point at the outset of his classic study, Meaning in History, and I quote, "If we abstract from a chair its transcendent purpose, it becomes a meaningless combination of pieces of wood. The same is true in regard to the formal structure of the meaning of history. History, too, is meaningful only by indicating some transcendent purpose beyond the actual facts." Unquote. Political history, psychosocial history, economic history, religious history, diplomatic history, each undertakes to establish the meaning of historical data, more precisely the nature and limits of that meaning as to its truth in the light of the historical intelligence. This it does in terms of a relative discourse-specific transcendent factor that figures as a regulative idea. If you're a fan of Rainer Sherman, it'd be a sovereign referent. An idea that gives direction, in the words of Andy German, quote, "to the process in which conscious life interprets itself and is transformed through its self-interpretation," unquote. That idea might be a configuration of political concepts, the principles of a school of social psychology, an economic doctrine, a particular notion of religion, or some concept of the evolution, norms, and aims of diplomacy. Okay, so while religious thinking as a mode of knowing, as of being, is inferentially indexed to the factor of the transcendent in its relative character, religious thinking in the, I was talking about historical thinking, now religious thinking in the form of devotional intelligence is an order of agent intelligential Geist, of a knowing as a being that is inferentially indexed to the factor of the transcendent in both its relative and absolute characters. Religious thinking of this sort has a classical correlative on this score in the metascientific first philosophy, the tradition of systematic onto-epistemology that runs from Aristotle to Hegel to Nikolai Hartmann, and in this century, in the last century, in this century to Sebastian Rödl. And like religious thinking as devotional intelligence, first philosophy in the great tradition orientationally leverages the knowing as of being, in which the factor of the transcendent figures not only in the relative but also in the absolute sense character. The most concise and responsibly informed way I know of to lay out in brief compass how the factor of the transcendent figures in intelligential Geist as religious thinking is by way of two classes of divine names that are ubiquitous in the Hebrew Bible, liturgy, and Jewish rite. Thomas Aquinas famously declared the divine name IB, or Hebrew Ehiyah, quote, "the most proper name of God, more proper even than the term God itself." This property of IB is a function, observed Aquinas, of, quote, "its source, namely being, and as regards the mode of signification and consignification," unquote. On the other hand, Aquinas found that with respect to indicating the divine nature, in quotes, in itself, the name God, in Hebrew Elohei, is more proper. That said, however, Thomas taught that the so-called tetragrammaton, Yud-He Vav-He, which is commonly misleadingly translated as Yahweh, those are the letters Yud-He Vav-He, is a still, quoting, "still more proper divine name than the term God, because this Yud-He Vav-He serves, he argued, quote, to signify the substance itself of God, incommunicable, and if one may say, singular," unquote. On this point, Aquinas put his finger on a defining component of Jewish religious thinking, where it is not too much to say that the most proper divine name in Jewish devotional life is the tetragrammaton, the Yud-He Vav-He, which is in a class by itself among the divine names, not derived from any predicate, any representation. It is alone with the name IB, a non-attributive indicator. To sanctify the Yud-He Vav-He is the seminal consecutive imperative. It is effectively the principle of sufficient reason of the law that in the devotional mode of intelligential Geist inextricably links the very intelligibility of the covenantal witness in Jewish prayer rite and liturgical hermeneutics to the factor of the transcendent in its absolute character. The reference here to the absolute occurs in a way that distinguishes the nature of spirit as agent intelligence in its defining the Jewish gestalt, which is to say devotionally attuned thinking that it takes its cue differentially and a posteriori in prayer rite and liturgical hermeneutics This from the entire class of attributive divine names, such as healer, savior, master of the universe, rock. These attributive names fall under the rubric of Elohim. They refer with a heterogeneous extension of depictive references to the range of what devotionally attuned mindfulness perceives as providential powers in their phenomenally determined causal efficacy. Within the onto-theological economy of the world, collectively, the Elohim thus indicate the transcendent as the a priori factor of determining meaning that is determinately relative to the life world and human circumstances. By themselves, however, apart from their reference to what the Yud-He Vav-He, the Tetragrammaton alone indicates, what again Aquinas calls the incommunicable and, if one may say, singular, or as I would also say, the singularity, that is the factor of the transcendent in its absolute character. Apart from that reference, those attributive names do not distinguish Jewish devotional thought from that of any number of other religions and cults. Hence, so far as religious thinking prescinds from what the Yud-He Vav-He indicates about the divine reality as the unconditioned condition of every determinate and every attributively named providential power, it is inconsistent with the principium individuationis of Jewish devotional intelligence. To conclude, these highly abbreviated reflections on the nature of spirit as intelligence adumbrate, I submit, a seminal metaphysical standpoint from which to diagnose and foreground the intelligential limits of those epistemically and culturally deconstructive currents of thought and the consciousness they engender, which either expressly or tacitly reduce the onto-epistemology of inference to analytic epistemology, axiomatics, and so-called analytic metaphysics. This deterioration of the orientational authority of knowledge is manifest in the culture devolution of spirit as inferentially articulated intelligence, a devolution that evidences nothing so much as a pathology of objective Geist peculiar to the high modern and late modern West. Symptoms of this pathology have in recent years become ominously manifest in the media and in the fevered dislocations of principle itself in American political culture. We all see and live with the consequences of this devolution in cultures and subcultures, but both popular and high, that bracket, pervert or otherwise, lose touch with the onto-epistemological warrant of the factor of the transcendent in its absolute character, the factor that in Kant, for example, assumes the form of the unconditioned, that he took to be a sovereign idea of reason. I think Jonas uses metabolism as a factor of the transcendent relative to life, and emergence in Larry's metaphysic would serve also as a factor of the transcendent. Okay, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Philip. Thank you for this challenging, provoking paper. It seems from what I can see that our second speaker, Oleg Beltek, is not joining us. He's supposed to join us from Petersburg, Russia. So whatever the reason, he's not there. So I don't think I should read his paper. It's available online for everybody on the program. So I'm simply going to go through my comment on both papers, and then we'll have some time for discussion. Very good. Okay. Spirit and Nature, a commentary on the papers by Oleg Beltek and Philip Stambovsky. The title of this session of the 71st annual meeting of the Metaphysical Society of America is not Nature and Spirit, and even less either Spirit or Nature, but Spirit and Nature. After reading and rereading these two valuable and provocative papers, Religious Materialism, Metaphysics of Nature by Sergei Bulgakov by Oleg Beltek, and On the Nature of Spirit as Intelligence, the Onto-Epistemology of Inference and the Factor of the Transcendent by Philip Stambovsky that we just heard, I came to believe that the key to their papers is that connective end, that connective, short connective word end. The first paper, I'm here referring to Beltek's paper. The first paper takes more of a traditional religio-metaphysical approach of giving priority to the spirit in its creative attention to the world of nature Well, the second paper, Stambovsky's paper, deals with, at least on the surface, a more secularly colored approach which accepts the spirit as intelligence and tries to show that nature has to include more than the factual and mechanical, and that the onto-epistemology of inference leads us through most diversive paths, almost inevitably, toward the presence and acknowledgement of transcendence. Both papers assume that there must be a connection between spirit and nature, whether in terms of their synthesis, Beltek following Bulgakov, or in terms of a necessary presupposition of inferential reasoning, Stambovsky following Zimmel, Gödel, Levitt, Hartmann, and the devotional thinking of the Judeo-Christian tradition. Here is one really interesting point present in both papers. Normally, we would expect that before the connection of spirit and nature can be established and clarified, we would first need to establish and clarify the essential features of spirit and nature themselves. Both of these papers, and perhaps a slowly but steadily growing current of metaphysical thinking since the beginning of the 20th century, assume that the essential characteristics of that connection will significantly affect how we understand spirit and nature. So it's almost, the process gets almost reversed from the traditional metaphysical procedures. That and standing like a bridge between spirit and nature plays a far more significant role than a mere grammatical connective between the two. That bridge affects what the shores connected would be like. That bridge, that end, is the key to our metaphysical thinking about spirit and nature. The papers do not say that explicitly, but they both presume it, that this end between spirit and nature is also connected with our humanity. We human beings are the carriers or the embodiments of that end. Perhaps in this respect, the authors of these two papers are the representatives of modernity, with a postmodern twist that our humanity cannot be confined to ego, consciousness, will, or anything one-dimensional like that. Thomas Mann, a writer and thinker who lived at the same time with the main protagonist of these two papers in the first decades of the 20th century, expressed the main topic of these two papers in a simple and poetic way. Quote from Thomas Mann, one sentence. Man is a noble meeting of spirit and nature in the yearning way to each other. Let me repeat it. Man is a noble meeting, eine hohe Begegnung of spirit and nature in the yearning way to each other. So richly ambiguous, so intuitively appealing, almost flawless and perfect, if we are to forsake the urge to get a deeper understanding of that mysterious and puzzling connective end than Mann does. Both Beltek and Stambovsky want to penetrate far more deeply into that end. Their papers do not lead to any conclusive results, nor should that be expected from short conference papers, but they provoke our sense of wonder to continue exploring what Mann calls the yearning way of spirit and nature to each other. The main merit of their papers, of Beltek's and Stambovsky's papers, is not that they present some definitive views, but more that they undermine some of our common thinking. Indeed, I believe that they both challenge the very logic of our thinking about spirit, nature, humanity, and several related issues as well. Let us first turn to Beltek's paper for an illustration of this claim. Look at the very initial phrase of his title, religious materialism. That sounds like a contradiction in terms. Beltek comes to this phrase of Bulgakov by following Bulgakov's criticism of materialism and idealism of the 19th century. According to Bulgakov, materialism and idealism either make everything mechanical or twist it into something abstract. In both cases, materialism and idealism turn everything alive into dead thing. To clarify and defend Bulgakov's religious materialism, Beltek relies on Bulgakov's equally puzzling concept of Sophia, the soul of the world, the anima mundi, which is the basis of the world, but through which the world is in a continuous transformation. Indeed, God and the world both are what they are, but they are also in the process of becoming, which means that they are not what they are, since they are changing. God, the world, Sophia, they are all one and many. Either one or many, we attempted to ask. Beltek urges us to resist this temptation. It, they, is, are, one and many, one-many. Beltek thinks that Bulgakov's work, quote, is a step toward the ideal synthesis of science, philosophy, and religion, end of quote. He's right about that, but this does not justify his overly optimistic conclusion. I quote the last part of his paper, the last two sentences of his paper. Nature, in all its organic fullness, is available to every spiritually healthy person, that is, the one whose worldview is based on the principle of integrity of the spirit. Such a sophological, that's the expression he uses based on Sophia, such a sophological view of the world, and its all concrete, all unity, cannot but encourage brotherhood, kinship, harmony with nature, and not hatred, struggle, violence, and domination, end of quote. I cannot see how such a conclusion would follow. The one all, which is what it is, and yet is always in process of becoming something else, would inevitably involve change, tension, violence, envy, and disharmony, in order to be followed by a temporary concord and harmony, and then back to tension and discord, and on a carousel spinning without end. Let me now briefly turn to Stambovsky's paper. Spirit as intelligence is the spirit of reasoning and knowing. It is, as Stambovsky emphasized, the spirit intellect of inference. Whether this inference is deductive or inductive, the principle of sufficient reason would require either that we keep finding ever new, further, less conditioned grounds for our inference until we can see that our thinking cannot escape the infinite regress, or until we find something unconditioned to stop that chain of reference or of inference. Virtually no one was convinced by Descartes' attempt to stop that chain of reasoning with his conception of innate ideas and his so-called proof that the material body, res extensa, must also exist. Nor did Kant's distinction between understanding and reason on the one hand, and regulative and constitutive principles on the other, solve the problem. Stambovsky hints in his paper that Kant's distinction of identity and difference as reflective concepts may serve us much better. But even he has to admit that Kant himself did not make much of this distinction. Stambovsky's strategy relies on 2 points. First, he accepts Georg Simmel's insight that, quote, life is at once itself and more than itself, end of quote. It's a beautiful quote. Life is at once itself and more than itself. Second, He anchors that chain of inferences for logical and mathematical thinking in history, in ontology, and in devotional thinking in a concept of transcendence. I want to emphasize that I strongly sympathize with both of these insights, both Zimmel's point and anchoring the reasoning in the concept of transcendence, but I nevertheless have two critical comments. First, I do not believe that the lack of or the rejection of the concept of transcendence in the analytical tradition leads to the pessimistic implications that Stambovsky suddenly evokes at the end of his paper. We are indeed facing, quote from his paper, a genuine risk of losing touch as well with informing sources of our very identity, end of quote. But not only, and perhaps not even primarily, because of the lack of recognition of what role the concept of transcendence should play in our inferences. Our current disorientation and decline, as proclaimed by, among others, Oswald Spengler in the second decade on the 20th century, is due to a vast variety of factors, among which are the collapse of our institutions, and I'm also convinced the inability of philosophers to adjust to the rapid changes in the world. Even more importantly for our purposes, I'm not inclined to accept Stambovsky's conclusion because he overstretches the concept of transcendence. It simply plays too many roles for him to remain functional, fully functional. This concept is affiliated not only with the idea of God in the Jewish tradition, but also with some unknown X, as Kant called it when speaking about the transcendental object, or when speaking about the thing in itself. For Stambovsky, the concept of transcendence even covers the purpose of history and the dialectic of Dasein and So-Sein in Nikolai Hartmann's ontology. If one and the same concept has to cover a territory that vast, it is in danger of losing whatever meaning and relevance it may have. This may be the reason why analytic philosophers are so suspicious of it in the first place. I would draw a different conclusion from the papers of Beltek and Stambovsky than they do. First of all, I would focus even more strongly on the relationship between spirit and nature. Both Beltek and Stambovsky recognize that this and between spirit and nature is crucial. They also think that this issue could be addressed through new linguistic conceptual means that are on the border of the meaningful and acceptable, but that could still function within the traditional system of thinking. Beltek relies on Bulgakov's phrase, religious materialism, the double nature of Sophia, and the fruitful ambiguity of all unity. Stambovsky uses the constructions such as Onto-Epistemology, spirit as intelligence, inferential knowing, and knowing meaning as truth. It seemed to me that both Bulgakov's and Zimmel's deep insights require something even stronger. Not just new language, but new logic. Kant and Hegel hinted at it and tried to develop it as transcendental and dialogical logic, respectively, but they did not go far. They did not go far enough either. When Zimmel claims that life is at once itself and more than itself, we should not be worried only about the principle of sufficient reason, but also about the principle of identity and the principle of non-contradiction. Think about it. Life is at once itself and more than itself. In parentheses, I take it that the dual nature of particle and wave in nuclear physics has sufficiently undermined the principle of the excluded middle. To conclude, despite the brilliance of his rhetoric, Perhaps Thomas Mann was wrong after all. It is not that spirit and nature are yearning for a noble meeting with each other. They have always been interconnected, and we have to stop trying to interpose that end between them. Thanks to the insight of Beltek and Stambovsky, I suggest that the more precise title for a corresponding section of the 72 annual meeting of the Metaphysical Society of America should be Spirit-Nature. Thank you for your attention. Beltek is still not with us, so let's see if Philip would like to respond to some of these comments that I made.
If I may, I appreciate your sending me them ahead of time so I could look at them. And so Professor Cicovacki finds two basic flaws in my paper. One is what he describes as its overstretching of the concept of transcendence. The other is a patently unwarranted causal connection that he faults the essay for making when it putatively advances a thesis that the decline of the West is something to which, as he puts it, quote, the concept of transcendence in the analytic tradition leads. While acknowledging that we indeed face the symptoms of a Western cultural decline, Cicovacki protests that this is, quote, not only and perhaps not even primarily because of the lack of recognition of what role the concept of the transcendence should play in our inferences. So let me address each of these objections in turn. As for the first line of criticism, Professor Cicovacki judges the paper ultimately unpersuasive because, again, it, quote, overstretches the concept of transcendence. The concept of transcendence, he says, quote, simply plays too many roles in the essay's varied examples of different modes of thought, quote, to remain fully functional. My reply is that the concept of transcendence is not as such a concern of the essay. The very phrase concept of transcendence doesn't even appear in the paper. And 5 of the 7 occasions in the full paper in which I use the term transcendence are in direct quotes from Zimmel. Of the remaining 2, one simply echoes Zimmel's usage, and the other in the full paper refers to the standard lexical sense to a peculiar element of Hartman's ontology. The concept of transcendence, so far as it does figure in the essay, is understood and employed only in its ordinary lexical extension, namely as a fact about the surpassing or being beyond some kind of bound or limit or other determinate moment. Aside from serving as at best a speculative point of departure, the concept of transcendence at that level of generality is of little use, raising more questions than it could answer in any serious consideration of inference, particularly one that probes, as I do in the paper, the Onto-Epistemology of inference and the various noetically consequential ways that the inferential form of conceptual norms, to borrow Brandam's phrase, distinguishes the nature of spirit as intelligence. In contrast with the concept of transcendence, the phrase factor of the transcendent appears 38 times in the full essay. The aim is to call attention to the factor of being beyond a boundary or a limit or determinate moment. This as a signal articulation of spirit as intelligence, intelligential Geist that assumes in different discursive contexts a different character relative to different modes of inference. I fail to see how this overstretches the concept of transcendence. 2, with respect to the second major objection, Professor Cicovacki does, quote, not believe that the lack of or the rejection of the concept of transcendence in the analytic tradition leads to pessimistic implications for Western intellectual culture or zeitgeist. I couldn't agree more. Indeed, I protest that nothing akin to such a sophomoric notion of causal implication has any place in my thinking. It certainly doesn't appear in the paper. What the essay concludes with are some thoughts on the troubling deterioration of the orientational authority of knowledge, and it adduces as evidence of this spiritual pathology, quote, the cultural devolution of spirit as inferentially articulated intelligence. However, the analysis of the factor of the transcendent, to which it calls attention as something ingredient in the inferential form of spirit as intelligence, that analysis, with its ancillary critique of analytic epistemologies of inference, does not elevate analytic philosophy to the role of a lead villain in the decline of the West. In fact, I think the influence of analytic philosophy as such on Western intellectual culture at large is on balance minimal and highly attenuated. At any rate, with regard to Professor Cicovacci's concern, the paper speaks for itself in the two-sentence transition at the start of the conclusion, in which I suggest that my, quote, analysis of the nature of spirit as intelligence affords a seminal metaphysical standpoint from which to diagnose and foreground the intelligential limits of those epistemically and culturally deconstructive currents of thought and the consciousness they engender, which either expressly or tacitly reduce the Onto-Epistemology of inference to analytic epistemology, axiomatics, or so-called analytic metaphysics. This deterioration of the orientational authority of knowledge is manifest and symptomatic of the cultural devolution of spirit as inferentially articulated intelligence, a devolution, that evidences nothing so much as the pathology of objective Geist peculiar to the high and modern and late modern West. So to finish, what leads, in my view, to that pathology is not, in Predrag's words, the concept of transcendence in the analytic tradition, but rather, as I stated in my 2009 monograph on inference and the metaphysic of reason, the diremption of calculative from meditative thinking, the bracketing of rationality from the onto-epistemology of what Pierre Rousseau termed intellectualism, which he glossed as, quote, a doctrine that places everything of worth, all of life's intensity and the very essence of the good, identical with being, in the act of intelligence. So.
Many thanks, Philip. I see that Oleg Beltek has finally joined us. Welcome, Oleg. We were expecting you a little bit earlier, as you know, whatever the reasons for the delay. I think it would take almost all of the time if you read your paper, and I rather suggest that maybe in 10 minutes or so you kind of you summarize some of the main ideas of your paper to the audience, and then we can open the floor for discussion. Is that agreeable to you, Oleg? Okay, please go ahead.
Dear colleagues, I'm very sorry for my late connection because of this miscalculation of the time. It's almost 6 p.m. here in Russia, so I just misunderstood everything. I'm really sorry. And of course, I'll try to do my best, although I thought that I'll have about 15 minutes. But anyway, I'll try to do it better. Sorry again. So my paper is Religious Materialism and Metaphysics of Nature by Sergei Bulgakov, one of the most prominent and probably least studied Russian thinkers of the 20th century in his homeland, especially Sergei Bulgakov, or Father Sergei Bulgakov. He was Marxist economist, public figure, a member of the State Duma, university professor, a religious philosopher, and finally Orthodox priest and theologian. He was born in 1871 in a small provincial town. So having actually escaped from his theological seminary, Bulgakov experienced sort of religious crisis, and he himself defined the period of his disbelief as between 14 and 30 years old. He was fascinated by Marxism and wanting to serve humanity and universal progress. The talented young man enters Moscow University at the Faculty of Law. One of the main concepts in Bulgakov's philosophy is the doctrine of the world, which is inextricably linked with the concept of creature, creatureliness, and creation of nature. The center of this teaching is the original concept of matter. But first, we must turn to the metaphysics of all unity and the influence of another Russian philosopher, Vladimir Solovyov, on Bulgakov, his influence on Bulgakov. This influence was decisive in the philosophical development of the future thinker and priest. Quote, philosophy inevitably strives toward the absolute, toward all unity or deity, insofar as the absolute reveals itself in thought, end quote. Bulgakov wrote it in 1916 when his worldview took on religious features. Solovyov's metaphysics of all unity is derived from the general doctrine of the absolute, in which he combines Spinoza and Schelling in a peculiar way, bringing to them elements of Platonism. Already in 1911, Bulgakov published an article entitled Nature in the Philosophy of Vladimir Solovyov. Interpreting the metaphysics of Vladimir Solovyov's nature, Bulgakov simultaneously expresses his view of the problem and reveals the defining direction of all Russian natural philosophy. Bulgakov believes that the doctrine of nature in Russian philosophy continues the tradition of the ancient philosophy of the natural soul and the Christian doctrine of the deification of human nature, interrupted by a rationalistic worldview. In the article, the philosopher names two nightmares that intimidate the modern of his days, of course, the modern consciousness in matters of the philosophy of nature. Bulgakov refers to them as mechanical materialism and subjective idealism. Quote, the first turns the world into a soulless machine, a dead mechanism. The second into an epistemological scheme, a bare possibility of knowledge, deprived of its own life. End quote. For both of these teachings, in fact, there is no living nature. The world either becomes a dead mechanism or pure knowledge devoid of life. Classical mechanical materialism does not satisfy Bulgakov because it is not able to explain, for example, what is consciousness, knowledge, or will. In an attempt to escape from this view of the world, idealism becomes an inevitable alternative refuge, and in the form of neo-Kantianism or Fichteanism, which prevailed at that time, but even then the world and the nature are deprived of life, turned into schemes of reason. Here Bulgakov asks a logical question: is there a way out, a breakthrough to preserve the unity of the reality of the natural and supernatural, the connection of the world and God? Solovyov's teaching about nature, which can be described as natural philosophical panpsychism, becomes the answer, and the later Bulgakov will interpret this teaching in his own way, differently, following the Christian revelation and freeing it from reproaches for pantheism. Thus, in the preface to the Philosophy of Economy, published at the first part in 1912, Bulgakov immediately indicates that one of the tasks of his research is to translate the ontological and cosmological teachings of ancient teachers of the Church, such as Saint Athanasius of Alexandria and Gregory of Nyssa, into the language of modern philosophical thinking, in order to reveal how the truths of religious materialism are distorted and obscured both in materialism and idealism. Here for Bulgakov, only Schelling stands out with his natural philosophy, which appeals to the mysticism of Böhme, Bader, and Eastern Christianity. In it, Schelling tries to express the desire for a philosophy that, on the one hand, would not detract from the importance of science and rationality, but on the other hand, would give preference to the connection of man with the heart of nature. Thus, the central task of metaphysics for Bulgakov is to see nature as being, through nature as an object of natural science, to see the organism in mechanism, and to know God's creature in soulless nature. This position is called religious materialism. In his explanation of the essence of religious materialism, Sergei Bulgakov defended materialism in general. According to Bulgakov, mechanistic materialism, if it is carried out consistently, will not be able to meet the spiritual needs of a person who, entering into interaction with the natural world, is in the search of a supernatural higher being who illuminates and comprehends natural life. This need of the spirit is met by religious materialism. Quote, religious materialism, along with materialism, recognize the substantiality of matter, the metaphysical reality of nature. It considers man not as a spirit enclosed in a case of matter, but as a spiritually corporeal, natural being whose metaphysical destinies are inextricably linked with the natural world. But at the same time, in contrast to materialism, it sees in matter not only the dead mechanism of atoms or forces with the epiphenomenon of life. In contrast to this metaphysics of universal death, of the absolute mechanism, it defends the primacy and universality of life, which develops in the whole mechanism of nature, and for it the distinction between the living and the inanimate remains not qualitative but quantitative. End quote. The central concept of Bulgakov's religious materialism is the concept of Sophia. Bulgakov comes to the idea of Sophia through the need to understand the world and the nature. He makes a clear distinction between the absolute and the cosmos, referring the idea of all unity only to the latter. Afterwards, Bulgakov developed this views and believed that despite the metaphysical unity of God and the world, they are in two unequal realities. Although the world was created out of nothing, it itself has its own divinity, creaturely Sophia, a metaphysical independence realized in the soul of the world, in the all unity of created being. In nature, Bulgakov is concerned with the cosmic aspect. The creature is all unity, he concludes in his work. It is the one many, everything. Quote, the ontological basis of the world consists in the continuous, metaphysically constant Sophianicity of its basis. End quote. Bulgakov thus justifies the existence of nothing as a metaphysical basis of becoming. The real connection between absolute and relative is realized in the self-positing of absolute as absolute relative. The process of self-distinction of absolute and absolute relative, here sphere of Sophia, is kenotic process for Bulgakov. Throughout Bulgakov's philosophical and theological work, the concept of Sophia, although underwent constant refinements and adjustments in order to finally be inscribed in the orthodox dogma of the Chalcedon definition. So Bulgakov's recognition of the creatureliness of the world frees him from accusation of pantheism and puts him on the same ground of panentheism. It is known that Bulgakov himself defined his sophiological teaching as panentheistic. Developing the idea of creaturely Sophia, Bulgakov discovers here the ability to connect the divine and the creaturely natures, the universal basis of the world, of creaturely being, of coming to be that resides between the absolute and the cosmos. From the basis, everything, all the things of the world arises. It is matter or primordial matter. So I'm trying to short it. The metaphysics of nature based on data of particular science and emphasizing the relative status of scientific abstractions combined with artistic intuition, religious insight, philosophical appeal to concrete experience strives to recreate the life of nature in all its organic entirety. Thus, Sergei Bulgakov's metaphysics of nature shows the gap between philosophy and science in modern conditions, that the gap between philosophy and science in modern conditions would be unjustified. It cannot be said that Bulgakov completely succeeds in synthesizing science, philosophy, and religion. However, this synthesis developed within the framework of the metaphysics of all unity is approaching the desired synthesis, which with further and proper development can give a fruitful combination of these. This synthesis is based on the problem of Sophia, which is central to the concept of all unity. And in his teaching on matter, Bulgakov defines it as a dark and difficult form and moves from overcoming Platonic dualism to sophiological monism, a transfigured body and spiritual corporeality. The real source of sophiology is a special sophianic feeling, familiar to many, which could be expressed in scanty language as a gift or direct experience of the eternal beauty that is mysteriously contained in the things of the world. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Oleg. Oleg, just for your information, Philip Stambovsky read his paper, then I read the commentary, assuming that you will not show up. So this is a little bit awkward. We are not following the regular order, but we still have time for a few questions from the audience. And Edward Papa has a question, so please go ahead, Edward.
This is for Phil. Phil, I take it you don't regard yourself as a secular philosopher, but you can understand why you might be taken as a secular philosopher insofar as this understanding analysis of life as ecstatic that you find in Zimmel, it reaches toward the spiritual, but you don't really see any movement in the other way, right? Or also with respect to institutions, right? There's this, which is the source of the crisis of, what Heidegger would call European mankind. They lack the element of life, right? But one doesn't have a sense that they're also being, I should put it, they're not operating ex opere operandum. They can take care of themselves as well, right? So how would you respond to the charge of secularism then?
Well, I guess I would protest that my whole purpose with respect to the religious thinking, in the book that I just did on that, was just to establish on independent grounds the intellectual warrant of religious thinking as devotional intelligence. My project isn't to, I certainly try to square it with Orthodox beliefs. For example, the connection in Jewish liturgy between the absolute and relative, like for Owen, the Yud-Heh Vav-Heh is the Elohim. They say it 7 times. So they identify the absolute with the relative. That would be like, I guess, correlate with Sophia for the Russian philosopher. But my focus is on the metaphysical themes, which you could say are correlative with theological or religious ones, because I see them as two sides, in the traditional sense. But my focus with respect to specific ritual, liturgy, and the rest of that are from the standpoint of metaphysics, and in our time, that seems to be one that's can be seen exclusive of being devotionally keyed. You go back to Maimonides and his guide, and Aquinas too. There's a devotional cast to what they're doing. Okay, I don't take that in my work because of where and when I am, I suppose living in another time and place, it might take that other emphasis or focus, but I don't make those kinds of assumptions because the people I'm trying to communicate with are not, responsive to those sorts of ways of assuming. So I try to lead to a way to establish the coherence and the soundness of that sort of thinking, by religious thinking, by demonstrating how it's coherent with other modes of intelligence. And so that if you try to deny it, you fall into a contradiction with your with your reason itself, or with the sense of meaning and knowledge, as knowledge is meaning is truth.
Owen, you indicated you would like to ask a question.
I would, thank you. This is another question for Philip, and I'm probably asking it because I haven't read the full spectrum of Philip's works on knowledge and transcendence. But my basic framework that I come out of, because it's most familiar to me, is something like an Aristotelian framework where the different disciplines are defined by their different subject matters. And if I'm understanding you, Philip, you're suggesting that a better approach would be to have different disciplines defined by different horizons of transcendence, so that you can have history dealing with the same subject matter, but some historians are going to be understanding it economically, others are going to be doing so psychologically, others on the basis of other kinds of appeals to transcendent principles. And so that's just a question of clarification there. Would you agree that we're going to be understanding the geography of different disciplines by virtue of the kinds of transcendence that they appeal to? And then the second question is this, that from kind of a strictly Aristotelian point of view, each science has its domain. And if you want to relate them all, you have to go all the way up to metaphysics somehow. But of course, now with work in emergence or reduction, we can see that the situation is much more complicated than that. We can take the various disciplines and we can have them speaking to each other without going all the way to the top metaphysically. And maybe with what you've discussed in regard to history in this paper, that might be an example, so that you can have a historian working from a Marxist point of view talking to a historian working from a psychological or anthropological point of view, and they can at least talk with each other and maybe try to work their way up to a more encompassing horizon of transcendence. And so my second question would be, when that happens, is that metaphysical, or is that is that still within the ambit of history?
Okay, thanks. Well, first off, I don't see a kind of hierarchy of transcendence. All I'm doing is analyzing, I guess you could call it philosophical psychology, and trying to make some points about how when something is meaningful, it's like Zen of the art of motorcycle maintenance. It's platform problem. It's always, or Gödel. There's a standpoint from which we can see the limits or incompleteness of something. It's like, the game of chess. If you don't have a concept of game, you may be an expert at all the moves, but have no grasp, the way that concept works. But that's beyond the specific strategies per se, but it renders them intelligible limits. Now, I'm not making any claims or about the specific kinds of reference that are used as transcendent factors that give the limits to any domain of discourse, if you want to put it that way, or of understanding or meaning. I'm just making the case that there is something that, like in the book I talk about Samuel Alexander, there's a notion, what he calls deity, that's beyond any limit, but we have a sense that it gives the sense of order, limits. You're familiar with Kant's notion of the unconditioned, okay? Kant says without that, all the conditions are absurd. He uses the word absurd. Without that factor, even though that's only a regulative, it's not constitutive, because it makes sense, because on the level at which we're doing the specific calculations and the rest, the series itself doesn't come into question. We're operating with the series as a kind of referent, or sovereign referent in that regard. That's the basis of how we understand the meaning and establishing truth of meaning. So we know things. So with regard to interdisciplinary discussions, it all depends on what someone decides to try to connect various orientations, say in history, a Marxist with a psychosocial historian. If you agree on some other factor that you're going to coordinate what makes sense in each of those domains to some other frame of reference that gives equal authority to the kinds of analyses that are going on in both domains, or at least establishes a basis for determining which is deficient from that standpoint. I'm only concerned with the coherence of meaning and how that's related to the fact of being, because I'm an Aristotelian too, and I think with the knowing, the known, and the knower are somehow the same, and I try to work that out with respect to a philosophical psychology. And Hegel, as a neo-Aristotelian in many respects, and especially in his psychology, his philosophy of Geist, the philosophy of Geist admits to being just following in Aristotle's footsteps there in many ways, although he develops it in the modern way we can understand in terms of Anschauung, representation, and Begriffen and Denken. And I take those concepts and apply them to the ways of making meaning and the factor of the transcendent. So I'm not making claims about some transcendence from a religious standpoint, just like what Kant says. Yes, the duties that we have, they can be divine commands. I'm not arguing against that. I'm not arguing for it. It's there. And in fact, in my book on religious thinking, I try to muster stuff from Soloveitchik and others and Sachs and the rest to show that this approach is consistent with orthodox practice and thought. And that's my modus operandi.
So from understanding you're not suggesting that each discipline, insofar as it works with a particular horizon of transcendence, is somehow incomplete until it has a more, you're suggesting that everything is just fine, and then what you're doing as a metaphysician is just fine too, but no. There's not, okay.
No, that factor of the transcendence.
Please explain to me your rejection of the hierarchy again, because the bigger you get, the higher you go.
Yeah, someone can always get more and more abstract, but abstractions as Whitehead said, always leaves out part of the truth. And I'm concerned about that. As you move up to the levels of abstraction, you're going to leave out more and more of what's important at various levels. And then you have to have some basis for adjudicating, or justifying those kinds of moves also. So I'm not going to go there. So that's that factor. That's that element of the factor of the transcendent. I'm not putting all my eggs in any one basket and making disciplinary claims. And in fact, I'm more concerned just with the philosophical psychology of it. I'm not going past the notion, how is inferential thought a reflection of how we are, because of what we know what our knowing is what we are. You wouldn't be your intelligence of a computer or being on screen. If that were taken out, you wouldn't be you to that degree. You are what you know, essentially, not materialistically, of course. And so, the factor of the transcendent does get, like with Gödel, it shows the limitations, the incompleteness as well. I mean, we and that's what causes us to kind of push to find another sovereign referent, or as Sherman would call it, or another factor that kind of does better when we run up against those limits in terms of some other issues, maybe a competing interpretation of historical data.
Thank you. Larry has a question as well. Larry Cahoon.
So I have a question for Oleg. I'm not sure whether the question is about something I don't know much about, which is Bulgakov, but then Bulgakov's relation to other forms of spiritual or religious materialism. So as I understand it, there are a variety of religious materialist traditions in Asia, partly in Persia, in at least one of the heterodox schools of Indian philosophy. And then there's even these sort of mystical versions, mystical materialisms that even made their way to Russia. I'm thinking of, people like Gurdjieff and Uspensky. And what do you think of that? Is there a relation between Bulgakov and any of those traditions? Whatever you could tell me about that.
Thank you, Larry. Well, I think that it's hard to say that there could be any connection, but I still think that Bulgakov here mostly looks for the Western tradition, and here he finds his roots. Although he speaks about ancient practice, about ancient understanding, and about that understanding of fathers of church, such as I told you, Saint Athanasius of Alexandria and Gregory of Nyssa, for example, he tries to restore this tradition, and he believes that it was distorted, that this tradition was interrupted, that we have to look with this new, even European philosophical view on our Christian, as he thinks, our Christian proper understanding of what religious materialism is and of what matter is, because for him matter is something that can be illuminated, something that can give hope for his synthesis, and that's how his thought develops. I don't think that we can speak about this connection with this Eastern traditions, although we can, of course, find similarities between these traditions, and it could be interesting as it is, but I don't think that we can say something that have that straight connection.
I see. Thank you.
I would, if you allow me, I would also have a short remark about Predrag's commentary. Yes, and it is very interesting because you noted in your commentary about that connection about spirit and nature and about that connective end. And it's very interesting that here, of course, Bulgakov would not agree with you, and there are, well, his disciples witness that he told, and of course, one of his most close disciple, Lev Zander, much later said that that in the word "and" for Bulgakov, the whole mystery of that universe is hidden. That to understand and to reveal the meaning of this word means to reach the limit of knowledge. And for "and" is the principle of unity and wholeness, meaning and reason, beauty and harmony. So for him, this "and" is really something very important, and we can even say that for him, this "and" is the Sophia, which he develops. So that would be my short remark. And I would, of course, say many thanks to your commentary, because it was very productive for me. And I hope that in my future also speculations on this topic, I would, of course, look at your commentary again. Thank you.
Thank you, Oleg. And we are sorry that there was probably a miscommunication with regard to the change of time in the United States, and that you joined us last weekend.
It's only my problem. I tried to calculate it correctly, but anyway, I failed. Sorry.
So
I should have sent you a special message about that. But we're glad that you made it.
Definitely. I think our time is running out. Barry, am I supposed to stop the recording, or will it stop on its own?
It will stop when you close the session.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you all on this, at least in New England, beautiful Sunday morning, for being with us and thinking some deep thoughts. And let us hope that next year we can do it all in person and get to know each other. Owen, we wish you the best of luck with taking over the Metaphysical Society. Thank you all.
Thank you.